Thanks very much for joining us for one more international event. I'd like to especially thank all the speakers because of their outstanding commitment. You can't imagine the many conflicts they have in their diaries and how committed they've been to this event. So I'm really thankful to those of you that I see from here, but also to my colleagues, Dustin and Francois. I have the privilege to address you on the value of water and water security. Last year, I was appointed as the cluster leader for the value of water in the European Technological Platform for Water, the Water and Sanitation Technology Platform. And it's a pro bono activity, so it's one of these things that is making my life complex, but it delivers in the sense that it pays off in the sense that I'm already available to discuss about an issue that, to me, as Dustin and Francois have presented, should be critical. And like common wisdom, most of the things that we do every day in terms of water policy have to do very much with this Penelope's myth. If you don't know the myth, just read this paragraph, but if you do, just stick to the last sentence, in which it says that she kept weaving and unweaving every day. And that's exactly what we do in water policy. So we try to fix things that happen elsewhere that have nothing to do with the water policy itself. And these, in very concrete terms, have to do with the lack of policy coordination, with the lack of good design of incentives. It has to do with the lack of integrity, with the lack of matrix to properly address impacts. We very often have a very biased view about the impact of water investments and water and sanitation investments. We end up discussing instrumental issues as if they were ends. So we focus on technological issues, on the financing gap. We focus on cost recovery, underinvestment. But at the end of the day, it is the case that these are critical issues, but they're all purely instrumental to the ends, not just of water policy, but also of social and economic development policy. So one of the points that I want to make, and it's fantastic how Carla is able to present these things as if she were an economist. One of the things that I'm going to present is precisely why are we failing to ensure long-term water security, and more specifically in areas like this one, like Mediterranean basins, in which most of the day you end up discussing about drought events and structural chronic water scarcity. But in days like today, you have suddenly intense and storm water leading to waterlogging, leading to floods, and we need to reconcile these different policy goals at once. And we fail to do that because, as it's very well known, any water crisis is a governance crisis. I think it's been clear in the two presentations preceding me, so I'm going to insist on some of the issues that Dustin and Francois have brilliantly presented. So, around this idea of the Penelope's myth, the first idea that I would like to touch upon is one that is very basic, but I'm committed to convey messages to the wider public. So I'm not just talking to experts here. And unlike common wisdom, the value of water, which is clearly connected to how water contributes to wider social welfare and individual well-being, does not change in terms of the availability of water in the biosphere. Why? Because the water in the biosphere is always the same. It can be in ice state, it can be in liquid state, it can be gas, but overall, it's the same water we have all the time. That's not the relevant issue. The relevant issue is that water, clean water, is a real challenge. Having water in the right time, for the right purposes, with the right gradient of salinity, with the proper accessibility features, that's really a challenge. So the value of water is very much dynamic and is very much changing depending on these context issues. And as I said before, these context issues very much have to do with things that are critical for all of us, but have nothing to do with what water policy itself can fix. So unless we end up, this endogamic trend that we have in the water community, water people to water, talking to water people. And we start talking about energy and technology and governance elsewhere and accountability and about outcome-oriented processes, there's no way we'll be able to overcome the challenges around water resources management and water services management. Can you hear me? No? It isn't working, I think. Is it working now? Right, okay. So, Dustin was referring before to Cape Town, and I think it's interesting to look at this. If you look at the chart that you've got on your left-hand side, you see the evolution of annual rainfall. And you can actually see that what happened last year and a couple of years ago, it was a very significant decrease in rainfall patterns in Cape Town. So no doubt about that. But the point that I'm trying to make is that there's nothing to worry about when whatever happens is something that you can't control. There's no way we can control whether rainfall, of course we've got an impact on climate change, but in a generational scale, there's no way you can control what's actually happening in terms of rainfall. What matters is what you do from the demand side, and I don't think we put so much emphasis on things that we do, things we're responsible for, co-responsible for. So when you look at on your right-hand side, you actually see one possible explanation, which is consumption for urban uses in Cape Town, and the greater Cape Town has been increasing. But the fact is that there was a program to control that, and it was flattened. So that's not the main reason. So if the main reason is not urban consumption in Cape Town creating difficulties, what's the actual problem? The actual problem happened elsewhere. It happened in the basin. It has a lot to do with food security, it has a lot to do with agricultural development. It has a lot to do with meeting other societal challenges that have nothing to do with those challenges that we seem to be able to control within the scope of water policy. So unless you look at what's happened, and the image that Dustin used from New York Times was excellent, unless you control what's happening elsewhere, there's no way we can ensure long-term water security for our cities and towns. Right, you may recall this massive event that happened back in 1930 in some states of the west of the US. Yeah, it was called the Dust Bowl and produced very apocalyptic images like this. Yeah, whatever happened there was a massive drought event. Yeah, one of the many that have suffered, still suffering, these western states of the US. But the important thing that I want to mention here is that there's some mutual resilience between the water system and the economic system. What made this a tragedy was not the lack of water, but the joint impact of the lack of water and a massive economic crisis that had to do with what happened in the Great Depression in 1929. So without that Great Depression, with a higher resilience in the socioeconomic system, this crisis, a water crisis if you want, would have not been as important as it was. There are many examples in the world. If you look at Latin America, I know we've got some people in the audience from Latin American countries. If you look at Latin America, let me just mention a couple of countries in which I'm currently working, Peru and Chile. If you look at Peru, yeah, it's clearly an emerging economy. It's been growing for the last 10 years at above 6% in GDP. It still has a massive social liability that has to do with 9 million people without improved access to water and sanitation, mostly in rural areas. But when you look at this country, a country in which Francois worked for many years, you actually see that there are three main regions. Yeah, the coast in the Pacific, you've got the high mountains and the plateau, and you also have the forest, the Amazon. What you actually see is that 80% of GDP, 2/3 of the population live in the coastal areas in the Pacific with just 1.8% of all fresh water in the country. This is not a miracle, this is a tragedy. Yeah? It's really critical to ensure water security in that context. But if you refer to Chile, where you've got a very wide diversity of climates, you see that in the north you've got the most arid desert in the world, in Atacama, and then in the south you've got the Antarctica. If you refer about the idea of the value of water, people may be completely unaware that 90% of the value of their exports have to do with water-intense goods. Yeah, it's wine, it's groceries, it's timber, it's copper and molybdenum. Everything has to do with using massively water, which they don't have, especially in the north, as I'll show afterwards. Right, what's happening these days? The problem is not just that climate and weather are really demanding for these countries. The problem is also that as it happens in Mediterranean basins, as it happens in the metropolitan area of Barcelona, the challenge is not only in terms of long-term availability of water, but it's very much in terms of our pressures on the different aquatic ecosystems. So what's happening in Peru these days? You've got these glaciers melting, massively melting as a result of climate change, and this is creating a paradoxical outcome in the citizens. Why? Because you see that in Trujillo, which is mostly a desert in the north of the country, you can see that irrigation canals are plenty of water, People are have outstanding harvest of blueberries, 5 times the size of conventional blueberries in the country. They managed to produce asparagus in the desert, In a place like the Valley of Ica, which is one of the top producing areas in the world of asparagus, mostly to export to the Netherlands, the UK, and other European countries, you find this really appalling outcome, which is the fact that water being used to water these asparagus is of much better quality than water that is being delivered to local residents. Why? Because they have to meet all these sanitary requirements from European legislation, which is perfectly fine. The point is, when you've got a country that is a huge emerging economy like Peru, growing continuously, they refer to the Peruvian miracle, but at the same time you've got these social and environmental liabilities, you're failing to address not just water policy challenges, but wider policy challenges in the social and economic development of the country. And the same applies to Europe. In Europe, we've got many situations like this. If you think about a country like this, in Spain, 70% of the area is prone to desertification. 20% of the country is already desertified. But we still use 70% of water for agriculture, which only accounts for 2%, slightly more than 2% of GDP. Right? And if we use all that water for irrigation, it's important to refer to the fact that 90% of that water being used for irrigation in Spain yields just 10% of the market value of agriculture, and the other way around. 10% of the water yields 90% of the market value of agriculture. So we've got schizophrenia in our national agriculture. We've got 2 different agricultural systems in the country. Right. I was referring before to Chile. If you talk to corporate people, people mostly focused conventionally on financial profitability of on financial profitability of their activities, they will tell you, we clearly see the value of water. Think of this, Minera Escondida, an open pit mining site for copper in one of the top countries producing copper in the world, Chile. And they realized that water was for them not just one critical input, but the input. Without water, there's no way they can take all that copper out. And when you see that, what they've done with private money, so we've no need from public spending here, is to desalinate water in the Pacific and pump it up to 3,200 meters over sea level. Is it crazy enough? But you think these guys have any doubt as per the value of water? Not at all. I'm not saying this is something you should practice at home, But if you do, take some caveats. But the important thing about this is that whatever's happening in places like this does also have an impact on wider societal challenges.
Right. When you look at the open pit mine, yeah, you could say like, what was the issue here? And the issue is that we have fantastic reasons to make really bad decisions about water. Why? Because of economic incentives. Look at how the copper price has evolved in international commodity markets throughout the years. Yeah? So even if there was some slowdown recently, they're still ranking very high. And what you see with these copper prices is that there's a continuous push, a continuous incentive to take all that copper out, as it happens in other countries in which I'm working, like Mongolia, for instance. Yeah? You go to Mongolia with most water being fossil aquifer water, so they don't even have shallow aquifers. And what you see in Mongolia is they treat water as a mining resource, because they realize that it's the time for them to take that water, to use it for the production of gold and copper, and to yield of that financial profitability. The problem is that now we know that this is a very short-sighted view, that unless we're able to address also social and environmental impacts together with these wider economic impacts and financial profitability, there's no way this is going to be sustainable at all. The same is happening in an area in northern China, yeah? 3 times as large as Spain, as the whole of Spain, where you see that they've got no water, but water becomes the critical input. So this is crazy enough, but in countries like this one, even in cities like this one, Barcelona received last year more than 12 million visitors. Yeah? Is this actually creating a problem in terms of ensuring water supply for the metropolitan area? Not at all, because the Spanish legislation establishes a hierarchy of uses, and it says, no problem, if there's some shortage, populational use will be protected. So households will be, and tourists will be delivered. The problem is not that one. The problem has a lot to do with what we do with the effluents of wastewater stemming from all this intense activity. Just to give you an idea, in 1940, Spain received 40,000 international visitors. In 2013, we received 60 million. Last year, 82 million. It's projected to grow towards 2025 to around 100 million tourists. Yeah? Is this actually creating value for the economy? It's 12% of GDP. Yeah? It's 50% of employment for some regions. Right? But is this actually creating value in the widened sense, contributing to social welfare? I have some doubts. And unless we find the right matrix, the right assessment frameworks, the right decision-making techniques, in order to see the true impact of all these investments, we will fail to sustain this activity. Have you ever thought about where the water is taken from to serve New York City? The water is coming from a beautiful area in the north of the state, in New York State, called the Catskill Mountains. So they took this water, and for many years, nothing happened. You know, it was easy to take like good quality water to the city of New York. Everything worked. But at some point, there was some intense agricultural production, for instance, in Croton watershed or around the Delaware watershed. And what happened is that as a result of diffuse agriculture, as a result of diffuse pollution from agriculture, nutrient pollution, created a problem. Then there were 2 types of people in New York City dealing with these issues. One said, no worries, whatever the problem, technology will always be there. So why not using great infrastructure to have like a proper purification plant in which we can treat water and deliver to all New York citizens and visitors? Yeah? The upfront capital investment and the OPEX for that investment was massive. Yeah? But someone said, we've got an alternative. Why not creating a very sophisticated institutional setup and a very straightforward payment for ecosystem services system so that we can ensure that talking to farmers, we engage them in sustainable agricultural practices so that they realize that the value of water is not just about using water for their individual interests, but connecting individual interests with collective goals. And as a result of that, this is probably one of the most significant payment for ecosystem services systems in the world, which avoided a massive investment in terms of great infrastructure. And I want to go back, and I'm sure I'm leaving out many things, but it's great to have a discussion with these two colleagues. But I go back to something that's been mentioned both by Francois and Dustin Garrick. We need to build trust. It's not easy. It's not easy to build trust, yeah? But we need to build trust. But trust is not something you build just preaching or appealing to, like the sensitivity of a population. We need to build trust, among other things, having the right incentives to do this. So making sure that the proper regulation, the proper institutional setups, the proper economic incentives come at play so that we can actually do what I mentioned before, which is aligning individual interests and collective goals. I've run out of time. I just want to leave you with these 3 quotes. The first one from Goethe is a good reminder that if we keep on addressing citizens as if they were stupid, they will actually be stupid. But if we treat them as something else, if we treat people as adults, and we explain that water is connected with anything, it's connected with gender equity, is connected to social cohesion, spatial development, agricultural development, macroeconomic performance, financial profitability for corporate organizations. Unless we are able to unveil these multiple dimensions of the value of water, we will fail. The second one is very much about framing the right problem. Very often, we are dealing with instrumental discussions. And the third one is very much about this idea that explains why sometimes innovation fails, because the challenge is not so much about having new ideas, the challenge is abandoning old and bad ones. Thank you.